Well, the first thing we can do is help them stop drinking, get them off the alcohol, make sure they come off safely. They don't have delirium tremens or a severe withdrawal, have seizures or that. And then the question then is, how do we keep people away from drinking? And there are several approaches we can take. There are medicines.
Hmm.
There are medicines like acamprosate or
Hmm.
naltrexone, uh, disulfiram, antabuse, which can help people stay sober. Uh, and the other approach, which I think is very important but not so widely used, is to focus on why people drink in the first place. And
Mm-hmm.
we know that people drink for different reasons. There are anxious people drink to reduce anxiety, often in social situations. That's why alcohol is such a popular drug. Why alcohol is served at parties is because parties are stress-inducing situations. Meeting strangers, humans are desperate to meet other people, but there's an innate anxiety, and alcohol takes that down. So if people are really anxious, we can treat them with other medicines or other psychological therapies to reduce their anxiety. There are other people who drink too much because they want to get high. And in those people, alcohol is, like a mood elevator. And we can approach that in other ways. We can control their mood with other medicines or, again, with psychological therapies. So we can tailor interventions to the
Hmm.
cause of people's excessive drinking.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Contraminds. In this episode, I'm talking to Professor David John Nutt. Professor David Nutt is a neuropsychopharmacologist specializing in the research of drugs that affect the brain and the conditions such as addiction, depression, anxiety, and sleep. Professor David is the founder and the chief scientific officer of the nonprofit DrugScience. Professor David is one of the world's leading researchers on drugs, and he continues to fight for evidence based drug policies. Professor David is also the Edmund J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology and the head of the Center for Psychedelic Research at the Imperial College London. In my conversation with Professor David, I spoke to him about now his famous influential map, where he presented the findings of his research on the harmful effects of drugs and the ill effects of alcohol addiction. I also spoke to him about his discovery and commercialization of synthetic alcohol, his study and findings of the images of the brain due to the impact of depression, stress, anxiety, and sleep disorders. Over to my conversation with Professor David Nutt. Today's episode is proudly brought to you by Effortless. Effortless is the ultimate solution for startups and SMBs seeking seamless money management and compliance handling. Effortless wasn't just created by anyone. It was crafted by chartered accountant turned entrepreneurs who understand the pulse of startups and SMBs. Visit www.goeffortless.ai and embark on a journey that will redefine the way you do business. And I wanted to specifically start this conversation for our audience. I wanted to talk to you about what exactly does uh, say a neuropharma. Let me
A neuropsychopharmacologist. What do I do?
neuropsychopharmacologist. What does a neuropsychopharmacologist do?
Well, they study the effects of drugs on the brain. And
Okay.
I do that. I'm a psychiatrist, so I have been prescribing drugs for mental illness for very, very many years. I think it's over 50 years since I prescribed my first medicine. And but as well as helping people with mental health problems, you can use drugs to explore brain mechanisms, and that's really my real expertise. I like to say that I think I've probably given more different kinds of drugs to human
Mhm.
beings uh, that work on the brain than probably anyone else in history. So I know quite, and I use that because basically the brain is a chemical machine.
Mhm.
Brain communication is largely dependent on chemicals we call neurotransmitters, And they're rather similar to most of the drugs we use, mimic neurotransmitters or block them in some way. So pharmacology is the way to interrogate brain function as well as to help heal the brain if it's disordered.
Mhm. Okay. So you've been so your work specifically on the the influential map created a huge amount of discussion. Can you talk to us about that specific finding, which created a huge amount of wave around the world on specifically the way you defined how drugs really affect human beings, and you really said alcohol was the worst form of addiction ever. So can you talk to me about that specifically?
Yeah, you're talking about my Lancet 2010 paper, I think over 2,000 citations. It was a paper that we wrote after I was dismissed by the government. For the previous 10 years, I had been advising the British government on drug policy. And as part of that process, I set up a methodology for properly assessing the harms of drugs in order to determine, whether they should be controlled under the law, and if they were to be controlled, under what level of control. And I came to a conclusion that the Misuse of Drugs Act and also the United Nations Conventions on Drugs didn't accord with the evidence of harm. And that's what got me sacked. And ever since then, I've been banging the drum. Well, let's try to put evidence at the center of drug policy, because if you don't, then people don't believe the policy, and then they don't learn the messages, they don't heed the messages, they basically don't trust anything you say about drugs. So the interesting finding about that analysis, which you intimated, was the fact that overall in the UK, alcohol was the most harmful drug. Now, we've since replicated this research. It was such an important, interesting finding that the European Department of Justice, they gave us a grant to do the same in Europe. And we took 30 European experts, and they took the original analysis and they changed everything and came up with the same result. And then more recently it's been done in Australia and in New Zealand. And they all come to the conclusions in Western countries where alcohol is a legal drug, it's the most harmful drug. And that's not surprising, because it's actually the most used drug, apart from things like caffeine and tea. And that tells you two important things. It tells you that, at the very least, you shouldn't be advertising alcohol because you're actually driving people to a drug which is overall the most harmful. But it's most harmful because of the impact that alcohol has on other people. Alcohol is not the most harmful drug to the user. Drugs like crystal meth, crack cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, they're more harmful to the user, and they're more likely to kill you or injure you. But to society, alcohol is the most harmful drug because it's so widely used. And then people have said, who cares about that? It's what the drug policy should be stopping people using harmful drugs. And I support that. But the reality is, overall, alcohol is the most harmful drug of all. So we ought to have a policy which deals with social harms as well as personal harms. And that policy, is something countries should really work towards, and because it would benefit everyone.
Why do you define alcohol as a drug, and what does it do to the brain, right?
Well, that is a very interesting question, because, of course, actually, until I got sacked for saying alcohol was a drug, the government said it wasn't a drug. It was a drink. It was a food. It was a lifestyle choice. Yeah. But and people just pretended it wasn't a drug. But obviously, it's a drug. Because what is a drug? Well, a drug is something which you put into a physiological system, otherwise known as a body, and it produces physiological changes. And that's clearly what alcohol does. Otherwise, you wouldn't use it at all. Yeah, so if we're thinking, alcohol is a drug. It's not just a drug on the brain, which we would call a psychoactive drug. It's also a drug on the liver because it's a toxic drug. It damages the liver, it damages the heart. So it's a drug that has a lot of negative effects. In fact, you could never license alcohol as a drug because it's far too toxic. But historically, it's been used for tens of thousands of years. So it's kind of escaped in general, escaped the censor that modern drugs would have. Of course, not completely. I mean, there was a period 100 years or so ago when the US and the Swedes and the Finns and the Norwegians, they went through the temperance movements there, got alcohol banned because they said it was definitely a drug, and actually one of the main reasons for the alcohol prohibition, the temperance movement was very concerned about the damage that alcohol did to families. That was
Oh,
the
is it?
real driver.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the ban revealed several things. It revealed the fact that people like alcohol, and people were prepared to break the law to get alcohol. It was very corrupting. There were these things called speakeasies, underground bars, illegal bars in America. Policeman outside was being paid off all the time, so that every policeman in America was corrupted by prohibition, and that's why they had to bring in a new agency, which we now call the Drug Enforcement Agency. It was called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics then, a separate army of people to try to control illegal alcohol trafficking. They didn't succeed. There was an awful lot of deaths, but they still exist now. And of course, one of the reasons we have a war on drugs in America is because there's an army called the DEA to fight that war.
How do you really approach alcohol addiction?
Okay, so before I tell you how I deal with people who've got alcohol problems, we would call that medical treatment. I would say that in general, medicine does its best when it prevents. And, we see that obviously classically with the vaccines for whooping cough, diphtheria, which save hundreds of thousands of lives. So primary prevention should be the goal of all healthcare systems. And there are ways we can do primary prevention with alcohol. We can give people alternatives, which is what I've been trying to do in developing my non-alcoholic functional drink called Arcarel and called Sentia. So we should have an active policy in all countries to reduce the consumption of alcohol and reduce the harms of alcohol. But even so, even if we do that, there will be people who become dependent on alcohol. And so how can we help them? Well, the first thing we can do is help them stop drinking, get them off the alcohol, make sure they come off safely, they don't have delirium tremens or a severe withdrawal, have seizures or that. And then the question then is, how do we keep people away from drinking? And there are several approaches we can take. There are medicines. There are medicines like acamprosate or naltrexone, disulfiram, antabuse, which can help people stay sober. And the other approach, which I think is very important but not so widely used, is to focus on why people drink in the first place. And we know that people drink for different reasons. There are anxious people drink to reduce anxiety, often in social situations. That's why alcohol is such a popular drug. Why alcohol is served at parties is because parties are stress-inducing situations. Meeting strangers, humans are desperate to meet other people, but there's an innate anxiety, and alcohol takes that down. So if people are really anxious, we can treat them with other medicines or other psychological therapies to reduce their anxiety. There are other people who drink too much because they want to get high. And in those people, alcohol is, like a mood elevator. And we can approach that in other ways. We can control their mood with other medicines or, again, with psychological therapies. So we can tailor interventions to the cause of people's excessive drinking.
So can you talk to me a little bit about what is synthetic alcohol and how do you see it, getting the attention and the adoption in a society?
Yeah, I'll give you a bit of background. So, I've been thinking about alcohol and the brain ever since my very first day in medical school.
Oh, is it?
Very first day, the very first evening in medical school. I'm an undergraduate. I'm at Cambridge, in my college, down in college. There are 9 medical students in the intake. And that night, what do? You go out to meet your friend. You make friends. You go to the pub. And I was horrified by how much some of them drank, because I couldn't drink that much. And I was, how did they learn to drink that much? They shouldn't even be drinking at all. They're only just 18. And then we went back to the room and they carried on drinking wine. And one of them had an amazing explosion. He went from being a normal kid to someone who was wailing and crying and wanting to go home and wanting his mother. And I thought he was going to commit suicide. I thought this man's having an acute depressive reaction. Should we call an ambulance? And one of his friends said, I know him. They went to the same school. He said, I know him. It'll be all right in the morning. And it was. He had a hangover. But I remember thinking, wow, this is staggering. This drug, which everyone uses, can turn a man who ends up, he's now a professor of medicine. I won't tell you what discipline, because you might identify him, but he's a professor in a medical specialty. And wow, it can change. In fact, the sad thing was it the friend who told me he's always like that. He had a heavy drinking, and he was I didn't realize at the time, but he was drinking because of anxiety, and he died in his 30s. So, you've got a really talented kid going to one of the top universities in the world to do medicine who dies of alcoholism in his 30s. And his friend actually had some problems with the GMC because of his drinking. So 2 of the 9 people that I followed were there have had problems. So I've been interested in alcohol all my life because I've seen those problems. And pretty much every doctor, every day meets a patient who's been harmed by alcohol. And my research started off trying to actually help people have better get off alcohol, less withdrawal symptoms. And then I started working on treatments to stop people craving and relapsing. And then about 20 years ago, when I was in favor with the government, I was working on a program called the Foresight program, where you look forward 25 years and you say, how might science change the field of drug use and alcohol use in 25 years? And looking back, I realized the first 25 years, we hadn't achieved very much. And it came to me one day, well, actually, alcohol is such a complicated and promiscuous drug that actually finding antidotes to all its effects was impossible. And the light bulb, wow, maybe we replace it. And then because by that time, we were beginning to understand what alcohol did in the brain. So synthetic alcohol is a molecule, or a series of molecules we're developing to give people what most people want from alcohol. Most people want a bit of relaxation. They want the effect of a small glass of wine or a small beer. They want to just relax socially. Most people don't want to get drunk, and no one wants to get addicted. So we're targeting the brain mechanisms of that first drink. And that turns out to be through a neurotransmitter called GABA. So we're basically mimicking the effect of alcohol in the GABA system to help people relax and get what they want from alcohol. But by just targeting GABA, we don't target all the multiple other neurotransmitters that alcohol targets to cause problems like addiction, dependence, hangover, brain damage, etc. Now, actually, it's not that difficult to do. We've made several molecules which can mimic the effects of alcohol. The biggest challenge is getting people to fund the research, because once you've got the molecule, you've got to put it through what's called food safety testing, so that you can say it's safe to be as a drink, and that costs a lot of money. So, hopefully, there's someone listening to this podcast who would like to invest, because that's the limiting factor at present: getting funding to take the molecules through food safety testing.
What's been the the research and the study, and what's been the finding?
So while we're waiting for the funding to take a new molecule, we call it Alcarel, and it's a direct pun on Canderel. I don't know if Canderel is sold in India, but Canderel was developed to give you the sweet taste of sugar without the calories. Alcarel is to give you the pleasure of alcohol without the harm. So Alcarel, the small molecule, the synthetic molecule, those are made. But in the interim, pending taking it through food safety testing, we decided to look into traditional herbs that are used in food and drink, and have been used for centuries,
Hmm.
and create a herbal cocktail which
Okay.
mimics the effects of alcohol too. And we have one that's called Sentia. And
Okay.
we have two now. One's called Sentia Red, which is a slightly more chilling version, and Sentia Black, which is slightly more for parties, so you can help you interact more and be a bit more energized with other people. So again, they both enhance the effects of GABA in the brain, uh,
Hmm.
but they don't give you the other problems of alcohol. And those are selling in Britain, and we started selling them in America and a little
Hmm.
bit in Europe. And people are finding it, really quite interesting because there are a lot of people who would prefer not to put their body at risk from alcohol,
Hmm.
but at present they don't have any alternatives if they want to relax socially. So Sentia provides that for them.
You're doing all of this because what I read is you love science first, and then you're using science for human good, right? That's really what your philosophy in life is. So, given that, how do you propose to kind of, drive this agenda?
Well, the agenda is change. We have in the 20 years I've been working in this project, we have seen the mood of people, particularly young professionals, changed.
Mm,
We've seen them becoming more health conscious,
mm,
and we've seen them moving away from alcohol because they know that it's fun to
mm,
go for a drink on the evening, but a hangover does impair your performance the next day.
mm,
And so we're already seeing alcohol consumption coming down in some particular sectors of the population. So there's a population out there looking for what we want. And that
mm,
has also changed the attitude of the drinks companies. So 15 years ago, when we started talking to drinks companies about this, they just laughed. They just
mm.
said, look, we make alcohol so cheap to make and we make so much profit. Why would we bother? Why would we bother? And I said, well,
Mm,
to save people dying. And they said, that doesn't matter. It's
mm,
their choice. Now, the drinks industry is saying, oh, their sales are falling because people don't want to die. Actually, there's a modern younger generation that actually knows the truth about alcohol.
mm.
And the drinks industry are now coming to us saying, well, maybe maybe we can work with you. Maybe, you could help us develop safer alternatives, to alcohol. Maybe we can expand our uh, um, sales and our the different forms of drink we sell by working with you. And we're saying yes. We're saying absolutely. But what we're going to do is this. The plan is this: is it the synthetic alcohol will be an ingredient.
Mm,
It will be an ingredient which we can license to
mm.
any or every drinks company.
Okay.
So they all will be able to make a drink. It gives people the pleasure of alcohol without the harms. And that way we can really reach a global market, because that's what I want to do. I really would like to reduce the deaths from alcohol. There are 3 million, maybe
Mm,
3.5 million deaths a year, premature
mm.
deaths. If we could just take that down by 10%, 20% by giving people an alternative, that would be a massive, massive public health
Yeah,
achievement.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I totally agree. uh, what's the scalability of this idea? Because can this molecules be mass produced? Can it be built across laboratories? Can it be built across countries in a consistent and a systematic manner?
Well, the good news for you in India is it'll be made in India, like almost all chemicals are these days.
Yeah.
That's where we've already been negotiating production of a prototype. So, but it'll be then distributed. I think it'll be made centrally,
Mm,
and then it'll be distributed to different countries, or it'll be distributed primarily to a company that can a drinks company that can tell us and prove to us it can actually deliver
mm.
new products. That'll be the constraining factor, and then we will license it to them, and then
Okay.
we will take some of the proceeds. And one of the things I really want to do is I want some of the proceeds. It's already part of our plan to put some of the proceeds back into my charity, DrugScience, so we can
Yeah.
then carry on looking at ways of reducing the harms of other drugs, not just alcohol.
Yeah, yeah. No, in fact, that was my next question that I was coming to, which is really you built a phenomenal organization which is for charity DrugScience. And that was something that completely impressed me in the kind of research work that you are releasing, the transparency that you're bringing to understanding about drugs, the kind of programs that you're running, going to schools and teens and talking about drugs and their impact. So, can you talk to me about the purpose and the mission of DrugScience, and what exactly does this charity do?
So DrugScience was set up very soon after my sacking by the government. The government didn't like me telling them that alcohol was the most harmful drug. They sacked me. And then a few days later, an investor sent me a text. He said, David, you don't know me, but I'm horrified by your sacking. Suppose I gave you the same amount of money to set up a parallel organization to the government's drug advisory group, which is called the ACMD. Would you do that? Would you? And would your charity then tell the truth about drugs? Because we knew the government was blocking the truth. That's why they sacked me, because I was talking the truth. And I said, wow, yeah, I'd love to, thank you. So he funded us for 3 years, and we set up the charity, and we started communicating at all levels, the media, the schools, the universities, about drugs and drug harms. And over the time, we've managed to keep it going. He stopped funding us, but we get funding from other sources, from grants, from individuals. And we've managed to, we've become, I think, the leading international source of non-political, non-commercial truth about drugs.
Okay. The related conversation that I wanted to have on this drugs thing is, at one end, we are a society moving towards, depression, mental health, sleep, and probably anxiety are the biggest, mental illness seems to be the biggest epidemic that we have.
Yes,
right?
indeed. Yeah.
And clearly, if you take an industry like an antidepressant, which is a $17 billion industry, right? Which is really saying, you need to have antidepressants all your life, right? And that's really how you get addicted to the drugs that you have all your life. You have a counter viewpoint on that, which is to say, there are other ways in which you can address this problem, and it's not something that you need to have this drug all your life. So can you talk to me about your perspective on that?
Yes, well, you're referring to the fact that we have essentially come up with a new way of treating depression. Traditional way, which has gone back now to the late 1950s, is to give a drug called an antidepressant. Makes sense. But they rectify a depressive feeling when you take them, but unfortunately when you stop, the depression can come back, or you can, in some cases, you can have withdrawal reactions. And over the last 15 years, as a result, emerging from the science we did, the brain science of psychedelics like magic mushrooms, we started to use psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, the active ingredient of magic mushrooms. We started to use that to treat a range of mental health disorders. Now, we started with depression, and the story is quite an interesting one, because when I began to study psychedelics, I had no expectation that I might use them in medicine. I was studying them because I wanted to know what the psychedelic state was, because it was clearly a powerful change of consciousness. And no one had been able to explore it before because they didn't have the brain imaging techniques that we had. And on top of that, these were illegal drugs. So most people didn't have the courage or the tenacity to do it. So we did it. We did the first brain scans, ever proper brain scans of people on psychedelics. And we discovered that there are areas of the brain switched off, that were areas which were switched on in depression. And we thought, wow, maybe a psychedelic can switch off depression. And then we did a study, and it did. I mean, a single trip, produce long-lasting improvement. Some of our patients in that first study, which was over 10 years ago now, some of them are still well after 10 years. It's because they've kind of worked through, overcome, their brain sort of reset. They're no longer locked into depressive thinking. And that's actually really very exciting, because now we have two different ways of treating depression. You can either sort of reset the brain with a psychedelic, or you can take an antidepressant. And we know from a whole series of studies we've done, these drugs work in very different ways, in very different parts of the brain. And in theory, patients have now got choice. Of course, in practice, they don't, because the psychedelics are still illegal and they haven't got a license, and it could be years before they do. But at least we're giving people hope.
And how does this reset the brain vis-a-vis an antidepressant? Was this what you have seen in the brain scan with the this psychedelic way of therapy, as you call it, right? I think that's really what I read.
Yes.
So how does it reset the brain, and how different is that?
Yeah, it's fundamentally different to antidepressants. The way I like to describe it is antidepressants work on an evolutionary early part of the brain. Deep inside the brain, there's a system called the limbic system, an area called the amygdala, and that's the stress center. Depressed people often get depressed because of stress. And what happens is that stress activates the stress center. And that then, through a mechanism we don't fully understand, leads to depression. Antidepressants dampen down the stress center. And we can image that. You can actually see that when you put people on antidepressants and you stress them, the stress center is less active.
Okay.
But that particular network is not just the stress network. It's also it's actually the emotion network.
Okay.
So people on antidepressants, they say, yeah, I don't feel stressed, but I don't enjoy things as much. I have a sort of restricted emotional range. And that often translates into they're is interested in things like food or sex or relationships. So there is a price to pay for dampening down the emotional center. Psychedelics work at a much higher, they work in the most evolutionary recent parts of the brain, the cortex, which is much bigger in humans than any other species. And they work on the circuits in which negative thoughts, so a disorder like depression is characterized by people having irrational thoughts about themselves. They think they're worthless, they're guilty, they've been done bad things, they feel guilty, they feel people don't deserve to have friends. These are completely irrational thoughts, but they get locked in. They become thought loops. And the more you think a thought, the more and more and more it gets ingrained. It's like a habit, like a thought-thinking habit, as opposed to, say, a motor habit like washing your hands. And what psychedelics do is they break down those thought loops. And we can see that. We can see during the trip, the brain is in a very, very different state. People are no longer locked into those negative thought loops.
Okay.
And that then allows them to escape from depression. And they can see themselves escaping it. And when they're in the escape state, when the depression, for a few days afterwards, their brain is in a much better place to deal with the problems which led to the depression in the first place. So they can not only get out of the depression, but they can also set their mind towards a much more adaptive way of thinking about the future.
Okay, and you believe that after multiple interventions, it pretty much you can stop the therapy, and there is some kind of a permanent kind of
it's one intervention.
One intervention.
Yeah, most of the work, almost all the impact comes from one intervention. We've done some studies where we've given another one to see if we could prolong the effect. We don't know if that does prolong it, but because we haven't had the money to do comparisons of 2 versus 1. But it seems that the first one is the key one. And why that is, we don't really understand. It might just be that once you've broken free from something, it's a bit like, an analogy would be, if you've got a sore tooth, you just pull it out and then things heal up. You've got a bad thought, you break it, your brain heals. But depression is an insidious disorder, and for many people, particularly if they've got an enduring depression that started in childhood, the depression can come back. And so we're now looking at whether maybe at 6 months or a year, you give another dose when the depression comes back to try to suppress it again.
Okay. Okay.
But the radical thing about psychedelics is it is just a dose, and that has another huge impact. Is that the drug's not present; it's only there for a day at the most, so you don't have side effects because the drug's not there to give you side effects.
And it doesn't encourage addiction.
No, they're anti-addictive. In fact,
Is it?
there's a very nice study done last year in Journal of American Medical Association showing 2 psilocybin trips within a couple of weeks could massively reduce alcohol addiction, and we're just starting a trial of 1 psilocybin trip for opiate addiction.
Okay. So therefore, you are saying by doing this one intervention, it does not become addictive to the patient, and while the myth is that it gets addictive, and that's really something which is completely counter to the to the
Swami, you're very generous. It's not a myth; it's a lie. It was always a lie. It was a lie that was created deliberately to justify. These drugs were banned in the 1960s because they were seen as supporting the anti-Vietnam War movement.
Okay.
They had to find a justification for banning them, and the justification was in part that they're addictive. They knew they weren't addictive, but they said that because that was convenient.
Okay. The other work that Professor you do is around even what you call as food addiction, right?
Yes.
And that's another huge epidemic that's there. Given that so if you look at the Indian health system, they really talk about the fact that the human body is built for scarcity and not for abundance.
Precisely.
Sorry.
Precisely. Yeah. We call it the thrifty phenotype. That when you're scratching a subsistence from the soil, you actually, every single calorie that goes in you gets put somewhere safe, and then suddenly you've got a surfeit of calories, and you end up being large like me.
So again, your work there, which you call it almost like a food addiction, and then you studied the brain images of food addicts, and you kind of recommended certain interventions for it. So what is that like?
Well, I've come to it from a slightly different position. One of the reasons I'm at Imperial College, one reason is because we have fantastic imaging, but the other is because it was a world center for discovering the hormones which control appetite.
Okay.
And it's so I've been working with endocrinologists for 10 years, we know there are hormones which can stop you feeling hungry. Hormones that can stop you eating. Yeah, well, there's one called Ozempic, which is everyone in the world's using. I mean, we were studying that 10 years ago to see whether we could use that to stop people wanting drugs. Because we thought that there would be an overlap, and there is an overlap in the brain processes of eating and desiring food and desiring drugs. So it may turn out that we can target some addictions, some drug addictions, using these what we call satiety hormones that make you feel full. The hormones which stop you eating in most cases when you're full. There's no question you can eat more. Most people could eat more, but they don't want to because the eating releases hormones which stop you wanting to eat. And we want to see if we can stop you wanting to take alcohol or smoking by using these hormones. And the great thing is, in those 10 years, they've gone from being a research tool, which we were giving intravenously, to now you can go and have your shot of semaglutide anytime you like if you can afford it.
No, but what I read about semaglutide is it does have side effects on your liver and issues around that, right? So while it's got completely now the most wanted kind of a drug to protect your obesity, but there are huge amount of side effects, is what they are calling, right?
Uh, yeah, there are side effects, but there are side effects of being obese too. I think we've got to give people basically, this is moving the description or the decision making about health away from just doctors. Doctors
Mm.
have completely failed to deal with obesity. If patients want to use semaglutide, knowing that they've got side effects, they might have diarrhea, they might vomit, they might have tummy pains. If I think it's got to be the patients are going to make a decision, and I think it's almost. I don't know if you saw recently, yesterday or the day before, big study from UCL, 5 years showing that using this drug in people with medical illnesses who were also obese,
Mm.
it reduced the medical harms. So I think, yes, all drugs have side effects pretty much, but this is this potentially can change the huge burden. I mean, there is a big question now, which is the biggest burden? I say the
Mm.
biggest burden in the world is mental health problems, and other people say it's obesity. It
Mm.
obviously depends a little bit on where you live.
Mm.
But here's a strange thing though. It's not everyone reduces their craving for drugs with these hormones. In
Mm.
fact, and we don't know why that is.
Mm.
It's so they're not going to be. They're not a panacea for addiction, but there may be. If we could work out why some people stop smoking with it.
Mm.
I mean, quite a few people say they stop smoking. Quite a few people say they reduce their drinking, but we have no idea whether we can't predict who those people are. If we could predict that, and that's one of the things we're working on, trying to say
Okay.
you should have this, and that of course then reduces the number of people who need it, and that reduces the problem of getting it because it's there's a huge demand.
Yeah, I think it's become the most wanted. Semaglutide has become the most wanted drug now because everybody wants to have it, and
Yes.
it's. I think Novo Nordisk is one of the guys who are producing it, is what I know, and
Yeah. They're the biggest company in Europe now.
yeah,
The biggest
correct.
company, not
Mm.
just the biggest pharma company, the biggest company in Europe, all
Mm.
based on this one hormone.
And that's this hormone that stops your interest in food. Is it? That's really what semaglutide has got.
It works on a receptor called the glucagon-like receptor. Glucagon is a way of an appetite suppressant. This receptor somehow is an appetite suppressant,
Okay.
and it suppresses your appetite. And if you don't eat so much, you lose weight.
Okay. Okay.
So it's a gate. I mean, we've had appetite suppressing drugs before. They were
Mm.
called amphetamines.
Mm.
The problem is they were rather light. Some people got quite high, so they could run. They were more addictive. I don't think
Mm.
semaglutide's addictive. I think it's
Okay.
probably
But
anti-addictive.
is it seen more like an anti-diabetic drug rather than an obesity drug?
But that's how it started.
Right?
That's how it started. But I think it probably end up being. I mean, a lot of diabetes is driven by obesity.
Mm.
So it'll probably be it almost certainly will show prophylactic value in terms
Mm.
of preventing transition to
Okay.
diabetes in overweight people. I
Okay.
would guess that.
So you also made a very interesting statement in one of your interviews where you said for about 50 years psychiatry has never improved,
Right,
right?
right.
And that was an interesting interview that I did. What made you make that statement? Which is quite phenomenal in terms of you practicing that for 50 years, and then you come back and then say, "Hey, I've not seen improvements in this kind of a profession, and we need to change that."
So what I meant was this: that in 50 years of massive, massive increased knowledge about the brain, that has not led to almost any major breakthroughs in the treatment of mental illness. The drugs we use today, antidepressants, antipsychotics, anxiolytics, were all discovered in the 1950s. They were discovered by serendipity. We now know how they work, but knowing how they work hasn't helped us develop any new drugs. And in fact, it's become so difficult to discover new drugs for brain disorders, particularly mental health disorders, that most companies have given up. And that's why the psychedelics, even though they're very old drugs, are so important, because they're filling a gap that isn't being filled by pharma companies.
And is that because there is no funding for this kind of research, and is that stopping because for something like a COVID, you could actually produce a vaccine so fast, while here for 50 years you're actually saying all these were discovered in the 1950s, yet you don't have research and funding backing for something like this?
Well, yes. People care more about COVID than they care about mental health. If we put the same effort into mental health as we did into COVID, we would definitely improve things a lot. There's no question, but we don't. And I'm actually writing that. You heard me give that talk. Now I'm actually writing a paper, hopefully for Lancet Psychiatry. It's called 50 Years of Failure. And I go through like the 17 reasons why we've got this, and I hope, but there are solutions, and the solution is take it seriously. And here's an interesting example: is antibiotics. 20 years ago, companies stopped making antibiotics because the regulators said, "Well, you've got to be better than the current ones." And they said, "Well, that's impossible." And they said, "Well, we don't want the new ones." Sadly, we did need new ones, because we need ones that were different. So when one fails, when a bug gets resistant to one, we need a different mechanism. Correct. But the regulators said you've got to be better. So the companies just said can't. And now, actually, literally today, the British government has just announced a new fund to help improve the innovation in antibiotics. We should be doing exactly the same for mental health problems, because they're not going away, they're growing, and our treatments, as I say, we've got no innovation in depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia. We've improved drugs. We've got less toxic drugs, got safer drugs, got longer acting drugs, but we haven't got new drugs.
Okay. And the innovation is primarily because of policymakers, or do you think the innovation is because of lack of funding or lack of thinking?
It's because the brain's difficult. It's because it takes 13 years to get a brain drug, certainly a mental health drug, through the process. It takes 5 years to get a cancer drug through the process. You get 11 years of exclusivity after each. Which one of the investors going to invest in? They're going to invest in the 5-year one because you get to results. So we don't incentivize people doing the difficult work of getting mental health problems treatments through. We don't accept it's an issue, and that I think largely reflects the fact there's still a lot of hidden stigma. A lot of people still don't think mental illness is an illness. They think it's just shirking or laziness or overeating or something.
Yeah, which brings me to a very important question, Professor David Nutt. You talk about mental illness being the biggest epidemic, and you also studied the brain like nobody else. Have you studied people without depression and people with depression, and what does it take for people to stay away from anxiety, sleep, mental disorders? What does your study of the brain tell us? Because I think you also wrote a book around the brain, and it was very interesting as a read for me. So have you seen the difference? And therefore, if I'm an audience, I'm a commoner listening to this podcast, I know mental health is a big problem because I work long hours. I'm working in stressful jobs. So when you actually analyze this brain, how do you see it, one without mental health and one with mental health? So what needs to be done?
Well, we can definitely see, when we look into the brains and do various measures, we can see that people with mental illnesses, there are signatures in the brain which are different from people who don't have them.
Hmm.
Why do they get them? They get them through some of them, some is genetic. A lot of it's due to upbringing, stress, poverty. Then a lot of it is due to subsequent stress, trauma. I mean, a lot of people get trauma, or they get assaulted, they have accidents happen to them. So trauma, so chronic stress is one of the major features, or the major predisposing features. Yes, we can see those changes occur in the brain. So what we need to be doing is we need to be training children to be resilient, how to cope with stress, how to deal with those setbacks, and not to become preoccupied with failure, etc. And we also need to, make sure that people, when they get ill, they get help quickly, because the longer you go on being ill, the harder it is usually to rectify that.
Okay. So literally, you're saying teaching resilience in children
Yeah.
is the most important. So you talked about prevention in many of these cases. So you're almost saying, but as a society, we seem to be getting less and less resilient, right? Because we are so, we are as a society, we are getting more anxious about many things. We probably had better resilience 50 years back to what we are today.
Yeah, I think for several reasons. One of them was kind of society was much more structured then, and it was, you kind of knew what was happening, and certainly after the war, there was a lot of optimism that things would always be good and getting better. And now we're in a strange situation where actually we're at the top of the hill. My children's prospects are less good than mine, which is disturbing to them, as and to me. But the other thing is we've changed our relationships with each other, and far too much of our relationship goes through these things. And also we're now, children are children of the world. They can compare themselves with everyone anywhere, and they can see influencers who are impossible to emulate, possible to get anywhere near, and they have unrealistic sense of their inability to be what they think they should be, even though, of course, it's completely ridiculous that anyone would aspire to do that at all. So we've corrupted children's attitudes to themselves and to their families, and to what they should, be doing. And it's also, and it's become very atomized. The individual has now become the center point of their life, rather than society. And I think that is a weakness, because humans are social creatures, and we need others to optimize ourselves. Whereas now the media it's all about you. You should do this, and if you're not this, if you're not that shape, that color, that attitude, that makeup or whatever, you're not a proper person. And that we've got to break that. I mean, that is we've put children into a position where they're almost all of them are bound to fail, because very few people can be these superstars on the media.
Yeah. So as somebody who's got tremendous amount of experience in this field, how do you think we should address this problem? Because you've studied the brain, you've actually looked at post-depression, I would say innovation, which I don't think any other scientist has explored and found. How do you really break this problem? If you ask me, one is really the interventions that you spoke about. One is how, and somebody who understands psychology, and who understands the brain, and who understand the impact of these drugs. How do you structure the interventions if you were running the policies?
Well, I say this all the time. I say there was a very nice roadmap written in the 1960s by a man called Aldous Huxley. The book is called Island, and that book is essentially the culmination of an enormous amount of knowledge about how you can use movement, music, yoga, interpersonal psychology, and psychedelics to make a society which is as close to ideal as you could get. And people should read that book and think on it.
But I'm going to quickly ask you a couple of rapid fire questions,
Yeah.
and that's really how we end our
Okay.
podcast. So the first question that I have for you, Professor David, is what does success mean to you?
Well, to me, it means help you turning my learning into helping other people. That's what success means.
Beautiful, beautiful. Uh, so if I were an 18-year-old and I was listening to this conversation, what would your advice be for an 18-year-old in a university today?
Hang in there. Things will get better. But definitely make sure when you've got a choice to vote, make sure you vote for parties which appreciate intellectual growth and development. And don't be
Mhm.
tempted into parties which are uni focused, that are nationalistic, that are religious. Vote for parties which actually care about the human.
Okay. And what do I need to do as an 18, 20-year-old to myself to prepare for this future that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think the answer is to have a number of different interests.
Mm.
Don't just focus on research. Research is a truly academia is a very tough field to succeed in. Make sure you always get plenty of exercise. You do sport. You have a strong network of friends. Um, uh, so enjoy yourself in other ways. Don't define yourself simply by your work.
Don't define yourself simply by your work. Brilliant. Uh, what's through these years you would have got lots of advice, and what's one piece of advice that's stood by you so many years? Can you tell us that one piece of advice that stood by you for so many years?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I think it's basically it, if you're doing science, you don't. Science is one of the great pleasures of doing science is it's cumulative.
Hmm.
You add to what others have done, and others will add to what you've done. And I mean, see yourself as part of that process. It's not about you, but you're part of history. You're
Hmm.
helping to build this phenomenal. I mean, there's no question. The science building is unquestionably the most important building that humans have ever built. So, every little piece you add does help us get nearer and nearer to wherever we're going.
Brilliant. uh, if you were to have uh, you know uh, a dinner with say two or three people, who would you want to have dinner with and why? Imagine you had to have a dinner, and they can be living or dead. Who
Yeah.
would you like to have a dinner and why?
Well, definitely Huxley.
Okay.
Um, who else? Yeah. Probably Jesus. Be
Okay.
interested to have a perspective to those two people talking to each other. Um, who else? Uh,
That should be good enough. Two people
that's
in, you know.
a philosopher as well.
Mhm.
Maybe Spinoza. Yeah,
Okay.
that's a pretty powerful team. I think I'd learn a lot from those.
Great. What's one thing that you always believed in that others don't seem to agree with you?
With very easy to answer that question. I believe that policy should be based on evidence rather than on political expediency.
Great. Thanks a ton, Professor David Nutt. It was a
Thank
real
you,
fun
Scott.
conversation, extremely engaging, and it was lovely to have chat about drugs and the research that you have done. You've done some phenomenal work, and your love for science came out brilliantly in this conversation. And you've been a crusader and an advocate and of science and protecting policy with evidence. And that's a phenomenal work in the kind of life that you have led. Thanks a lot, and lovely having a conversation with you.
Thank you too.
Thanks for listening to this episode. For selected links and detailed show notes, visit www.contraminds.com. Follow ContraMinds on social media and let us know who you would like to see next on the podcast. If you're listening to ContraMinds on Apple Podcasts, do share your comments and give us a rating. We are keen to know what you're thinking. ContraMinds is also on YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and stay up to date on all our releases. Thanks for listening and stay safe.